So now we also have to ask ourselves a particular question. Is behavior really trait-like? To what extent are we, does our personality essentially fit our behavior? We look at our traits, we look at our behaviors. Shouldn't our behaviors match our traits? Some would say no. Some would say that your behavior varies across context. One context you'll be more friendly, in another context you'll be less friendly. In one context you'll be more extroverted, in another context you'll be more introverted. And it's more or less the situation that has an enormous impact on guiding your behavior. And there's actual truth to that. Your situation can guide your behavior. If any of you have been in the military, you may find that in your particular group that there are people of all different types and all different personality characteristics. But when the time comes to march, you all march in lockstep. You're all behaving the same way because you're trained to do so. It's the situation that's guiding your behavior, much more so than your personality in that particular case. And that's kind of the way it has to be. If you want to be following orders and working as a group, then you have to be guided by what is required in the situation, not just your individual personality. There are situations like that. Those so-called strong situations have a strong impact on, really guiding your behavior. But here's the thing. This is what Walter Mischel found probably about 30 or 40 years ago, that the relationship, the correlation between your personality traits as reported on those self-report scales and your actual behavior is actually approximately 0.30, which is not earth-shattering. It's kind of it's kind of like a moderate correlation. It's nothing to celebrate necessarily. It's a relatively low personality coefficient. This is the relationship between your personality and your behavior. 0.30 doesn't sound that particularly good. So based on that, they may say, well, maybe the personality has some effect, but other factors seem to be playing a bigger role. Maybe those self-report measures of personality have a lot of error. They're not particularly good at measuring what they're supposed to be measuring. Maybe you're only measuring personality at one moment of time when someone is sitting down taking a questionnaire, but you're not measuring personality over one situation after another after another. If you can actually measure personality, if you measure link personality and behavior by observing multiple instances of behavior, then you would probably see that over time the behaviors would do a better job of matching up with the personality, because you'll have both strong situations and so-called weak situations where your individuality would be more likely to come through. And in that case, your individuality would be eventually reflected in your behavior over an aggregation of multiple behaviors. The pure situationist perspective on personality is to say that you want to study personality, study the situations people are in. It's the situations that drive your behavior, and your personality is relatively unimportant. That radical position really has not been shown to be completely accurate. It is quite true that situations, particularly strong situations, have an enormous effect on guiding our behavior. But there are many ways in which your personality and your behavior kind of interact with each other, such that you can't just simply say that we are just floating around and just waiting to react to the situations that come to us. We have our own individual choices. We don't necessarily just fall into these situations. We also create situations. We also choose to enter situations. This is where personality comes into play. It ain't all just the situation. But since I am a social psychologist, I will definitely tell you that the situation plays an enormous role on describing what, in terms of predicting what we do and how we do it. Okay? You can create an environment which will pretty accurately and pretty effectively and pretty reliably guide people to behave in a particular way. And again, many examples from social psychology show how situations can essentially drive behavior. But you really have to look at an interaction between the two. The idea that your personality and the situations that you're in kind of work together, interact with each other to describe your behavior. That you can't just look at personality alone. You can't just look at situations alone to describe who we are and what we do. You have to look at the interaction between the two. And this interaction will give you a better, more accurate understanding of how personality and situation go together to determine behavior. That's what we want to find. We want to predict behavior. Is it due to the person or is it due to the situation? The answer is it is due to an interaction of the person and the situation. The analysis of variance approach, or the ANOVA approach, is really just based on a statistical analysis called the analysis of variance, which looks at how two different variables interact with each other. And you can use this approach to analyze personality. So look at this chart on this particular slide. Here you have two different personality characteristics. People who are anxiety prone and people who are not prone to anxiety. So you have two groups of people that differ on a particular personality characteristic. You follow? The red line represents anxiety prone. The blue line, not prone to anxiety. Okay. If there is no test, if there is a situation where there is no test, in this particular situation, this is a weak situation, this is a situation which would not be likely to cause any stress, so nothing stressful is happening, then what is the difference under the no test circumstance between anxiety prone people and not anxiety prone people in terms of nail biting? Neither of them are biting nails. If you look at the vertical axis on this chart, it is nail biting. So the behavior we're interested in is nail biting. If there is no test, then there's no reason to bite your nails if you're anxiety prone. So neither anxiety prone or people who are not anxiety prone, neither of them will bite their nails. But then comes test time. Now realize that nail biting is a behavioral symptom of anxiety, right? Look what happens when there's a test. People who are anxiety prone, yeah, they'll bite their nails. The people who are not prone to anxiety, well, they're not really going to bite their nails either way. The reason why we would take this analysis of variance approach, I want you to take a look at something. What if we only looked at the situation in this case? What if we only looked at whether or not there was a test and we wanted to predict nail biting based on whether or not there was a test? Forget about anxiety at all. Let's just look at nail biting, test versus no test. Is there more nail biting when there is a test? The answer is yes. If you look here at the midpoint between these 2 points, this is the extent of the nail biting here when there is no test. When there is a test, the nail biting is about here. If you look here, I'm just going to follow the arrow here. Follow this. It's kind of up here. So compare this point with this point with this point. Yes, there is more nail biting when there is a test coming up. When there is a test coming up. Makes sense, right? But if you're not getting the full picture here. Because if you only looked at people who are not prone to anxiety, then you'd say there's no difference in nail biting. There's no nail biting either way. So you're missing out on that information. You could also look at it from the other direction here. Do people who have a lot of who are anxiety prone, are they more likely to bite their nails than people who are not prone to anxiety? Sure. If you look at the average between these 2 points, it'd be right about there. Over here, right here. So anxiety prone people bite their nails, yes. Not prone to anxiety, bite their nails, no. But we're not getting all the information. If there is no test, then there ain't no difference between anxiety-prone people and not anxiety-prone people. When there is a test, there is a difference. But on average, yeah, anxiety-prone people bite their nails more than non-anxiety. Therefore, the only way to really get the full picture of the relationship between personality, in this case anxiety proneness, and behavior, in this case nail biting, is to look at both the personality, anxiety prone or not anxiety prone, and the situation, test versus no test. You need both the personality and the situation to get a complete answer here. Relying on just one, relying just on the situation, test versus no test, or anxiety prone versus not anxiety prone, you're only getting half the picture. You're not getting the full picture of what is going on. Hope this makes sense. Also remember that there are a number of ways that your personality has an impact on the situation. Likewise, how the situation can have an impact on your personality, and so on. The interaction between personality and situation plays a big role in your behavior, and there are just a number of different ways in which they connect. For example, personality influences the situations people choose to enter. Okay? You don't just wake up one morning in church. Somehow you got on your feet and you walked into the building. Likewise, scuba diving. Nobody forced you to put on a wetsuit and jump in the water. You are choosing. Your personality plays a big role in the choices that you make, in the college you attend, in the people you decide to marry. All of these choices you make come from your personality. Furthermore, when you enter a situation, you are going to have an impact on the situation itself. You are going to be a person who affects the situation. Likewise, you're evoking different responses from other people. So in other words, if you are high in agreeableness, let's say, remember the big 5 characteristics. If you are high in agreeableness, then when you enter a situation where you're interacting with other people, you are probably not going to get into a lot of fights because you're not going to really be insulting anybody or anything like that. You are, but if you are in, but if you are going to a, oh, excuse me, I'm gonna pause it here a second. Okay, we're back. So again, you choose to, your personality affects what situations you choose to enter. The situation will evoke different, people will evoke different responses from others. A person who's highly agreeable will not get into a lot of fights. People who's low in agreeableness, they may insult other people, they may get into some fights. Basically, the result is your personality can influence situations such that the situation is actually different for a particular person. So even you guys here, experiencing the same thing, listening to this same exciting lecture, you are, you're going to be experiencing, your personality is going to affect how you experience this situation here. So here are some more specific examples of ways in which the personality and situation interact to essentially predict behavior. People with different personalities, they choose different environments. The school you attend and music you listen to are partly based on your dispositions, on your personality. Your personality shape how we react to events. Anxious people react to situations differently than calm people. Remember the nail biting? People who are anxiety prone are going to bite their nails when test time comes. People who are not anxiety prone, they won't bite their nails. Finally, our personality shapes situations. How we view and treat people influences how they treat us. If you're nice to other people, they'll be nice to you typically. If you're mean to other people, they'll likely be mean to you. Your mama could have told you that. But basically, that is some examples of how personality and situations interact. So now let's revisit Walter Mischel's 0.30 personality coefficient and take another look at it and see whether or not that really indicates that there is a big problem when it comes to linking personality and behavior. If the study is well done, if the measures that are used are good, then you are going to do a better job of predicting behavior from your personality. Poorly designed measures of personality are not going to do a very good job of predicting behavior. If the personality is a better match for the particular behavior, the specific behavior, then it's going to do a good job of predicting the behavior. If the behavior is measured appropriately, likewise. So if the measurement is done appropriately, then the correlation should be higher. But another thing is a 0.30 correlation is not really that big of a deal, because you have to remember that personality, your behavior is affected by so many different things. It's affected by different aspects of your personality. Situations change all the time. So as a result, predicting behavior just based on one particular personality, like say extroversion, is not really going to do a great job of predicting behavior. If you look at extroversion plus self-consciousness plus trait anxiety plus many, many others that could influence the behavior of asking someone for a date, then you're talking about behavior being multiply determined. And that's something to remember, is that not just one single thing answers all questions when it comes to behavior. So if we want to look at personality, more contemporary view of it is that personality is linked to behavior only when it's in a situation that brings that particular personality characteristic, the situation that brings it out. The situation needs to bring out that particular personality characteristic, which would then bring out the behavior. So if you're in a really strong situation where everyone is basically doing the same thing, then personality isn't going to have much of an influence at all. But in a situation that is a more weaker situation, then personality plays a bigger role in that. And there are some situations which really bring out some aspect. If you're an extroverted person, being at a party really brings that characteristic of you out. More so than perhaps if you're in a classroom. Make sense? You're around people in both of those cases, but the extroversion is more likely to come to the surface at a party, for sure. The patterns that exist between the personality, situation, and behavior are going to be different for different people, and that represents the individual uniqueness. One person might be extroverted in class, but not at parties. So in that particular case, that represents a personality situation match that will better predict behavior for one person than for another. And furthermore, with getting back into the ideographic point of view, looking at what the personality trait means to the individual who has that trait, means that it's that different meaning is going to essentially affect their behavior in different ways than somebody else. What is extroverted for me may be different from your definition of it, and my extroversion is going to affect my behavior differently than your extroversion is going to affect your behavior. That's what we're talking about here. Okay, get into personality assessment. If you go through this textbook, you'll see that each chapter talks about both assessment and also behavioral problems that reflect personality, that have to do with personality. Clearly, assessment, measurement of personality is very, very important when it comes to the trait perspective, because we're interested in these traits. We need to measure these traits, and therefore you have to find good ways of assessing these traits. So assessment is very important to the trait perspective. Most of the time we're using self-report measures in the trait perspective, because again, you want to know how one person's understanding of their own personality happens to be. You have to ask them in a self-report measure. I mean, yes, you could observe their behavior, but you want someone's personal expression of what their personality is, how they define it, then really the only way to do that is to ask them in a self-report measure, be it an interview or a questionnaire. You also want to look at multiple indicators of your personality. You don't want to just maybe look at the self-report. You want to do some behavioral observations. You want to use some interviews. The best way to assess personality is to use multiple measurements of it. And that way you're going to get the best picture of what someone's personality actually is going to be. And again, from these multiple measurements, your analysis of perhaps your scores on the Big Five, for example, could create a personality profile. So let's say maybe you want to look at your scores on the Big Five. You may score high on conscientiousness, low on agreeableness, in the middle of the road on extroversion, and so on. That combination reflects your own personal personality profile. But obviously, assessment is important. You want to make sure that your measures are reliable and valid, making sure that you're getting accurate assessments of personality and behavior. Now, what does the Big Five tell us? What can the Big Five, the five-factor theory, tell us about behavioral disorders, personality disorders, people who have psychological problems? Okay? You might say that someone who, well, for one thing, basically, the people who have, disorders, the idea that they deviate from cultural norms, disorders interfere or disrupt your life, or they interfere or disrupt the lives of others. These three particular characteristics more or less define psychological disorders. If we're going to call someone having a disorder, it would have to have these three components to it. It needs to deviate from the norms that you live in your culture. It needs to interfere or disrupt your life, and interfere or disrupt the lives of others. So it basically should include all three of these. You can look at your the Big Five and say, Well, what if somebody was really, 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 really high in, say, neuroticism? How might that appear in that person's life? A person who is really, really high in neuroticism is probably going to have a lot of problems in their life. They're going to be highly anxious. They are going to have a lot of difficulties dealing with stress. They're going to probably have health problems as well. So someone who is really, really high on the anxiety may have actually an anxiety disorder, as an example. Someone who is really, 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 really low on extroversion, who would be on the introverted side, well, maybe that might be someone who goes and lives in a shack somewhere in the middle of the woods and doesn't want to be around other people. Now, that person is probably not necessarily going to be particularly psychologically healthy. Really, really low on the extroversion dimension would be indicated there. Another thing to consider is that just because you are, say, high in neuroticism does not mean you have a psychological disorder. I'm sure many of you listening to this particular lecture, many of you would possibly score high on neuroticism. It does not mean there's anything wrong with you. It does not mean you have a psychological disorder. But it could mean that you have a vulnerability to developing a psychological disorder if a particular circumstance were to bring it up. This represents the diathesis stress model. If you have a vulnerability to a particular health circumstance, the diathesis stress model would essentially say that if a situation came up that made this illness more likely to occur, you would essentially definitely, you'd be much more likely to get it than someone who is not prone to those problems. So someone who here in this class who has a very high level of neuroticism, you're probably going to get a lot nervous when tests come up. But then when the tests are over, you can cool down and you'll be fine, and you'll calm down, you'll be fine, and everything like that. But you're not really necessarily experiencing a really, really stressful circumstance, like being in combat or something. Someone who is high in neuroticism would probably be much more likely to develop, say, post-traumatic stress disorder. And it just has to do with that kind of circumstance, a strong circumstance like that, would be much more likely to bring it on for someone high in neuroticism. So that's where it comes about. It has to do with the vulnerability, but it doesn't. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that the disorder would necessarily come out. All right. Well, next time we are going to get to chapter 5, the motive perspective. It's another way of looking at this. Kind of is a way of looking at what is going on inside the person, what kind of goals the person may be having that might be leading them to develop personality characteristics. So in other words, your personality and your behavior reflects various motives that you may have, various goals that you may be having that you're seeking. All right. I will see you next time.